why does your left hand sound boring? Let's say you're playing kind of a student arrangement of Sitting on the Dock of the Bay. So we've got melody in the right hand, simple chords in the left hand. So many students come to me and say, I'm sick of playing that way. My left hand is boring. And I feel like my biggest problem is I need to make my left hand more interesting. And then I hear them do this. Now, to my ears, that sounds more like a student arrangement than the first arrangement I played. And that's because you're trying to reinvent the wheel, right? You know some chord theory and you have those chord symbols in front of you. So you try to make things more interesting by creating that arpeggio pattern using the chord symbols. The thing is, with music, you don't have to reinvent the wheel. You can base what you do with your two hands off what generations of great musicians have done. So I want to give you some real-world examples here in the context of this song. Let's talk about what you actually might do with your left and your right hand in 3 different scenarios. First, if you were playing this song with a cover band. Second, if you were alone at the piano accompanying a singer. And finally, what you might do if you were covering this song solo piano, playing the melody and accompanying yourself. All right, so if you're playing in a cover band, let's assume you have all the instruments we hear on the original recording. You've got guitar, bass, drums. You're playing acoustic piano. In this situation, you really want to rely on your ears and not just on a chord chart or some sheet music that you find. So the first place you want to start is just listen really closely to the recording to see what they actually did on the record. So I'm actually going to remind myself right now of how the whole thing sounds so I can play this more accurately. Okay, so I'm going to do my best here to replicate what I hear on the record. And this is in the absence of those other instruments. So it's going to sound a little funny, but here's what I might do. So that's more or less what I heard on the recording. Now, something I want to note, on the recording, the bass of the piano part is almost completely gone from the mix. And actually, on first listen, I didn't even hear, it didn't sound to me like there was anything going on in the pianist's left hand. It sounded to me like it was just that kind of chord part I played. We're playing some rhythm, we're playing versions of these chords where maybe I'm adding a little bit of like bluesy grease. And then there's a spot where the pianist always highlights this movement from the B to the C chord with that kind of like chromatic movement. That's the really important thing, because that's what I heard. That's what stood out to me in the mix. And if I were playing this with a band, I might actually just drop out the left hand altogether, depending on the situation, because you start to fight with the bass player if you play big, heavy octaves like that. So speaking to this idea of what do the right and left hand do, I want you to think of this much more in terms of what musical part do you want to play, rather than I have some formula that I can give my right hand and some formula that I can give my left hand. This is a more advanced way of thinking about things than the student approach, where it's like, okay, my left hand always does this, my right hand always does this, I'm following theory rules. But it's going to make you a much better musician to think this way. Because what we hear is not hands, right? We hear parts. And especially in a song like this that was originally produced with a full band, everybody in the band is playing a part, right? It's this set of like interlocking melodies, chords, rhythms that all fit really well together. So anytime you're playing a song in a cover band, your job is to find your part. So your best place to start is listen really closely to the record, try to find out what they're doing. And then, you might be playing with a slightly different set of instruments. So you got to open your ears and problem solve. So that's where if I felt like, in the live setting, my left hand was really fighting with the bass player for the low end, I would just leave it out. And I would only play with my right hand, maybe help out a little bit with octave below the top note of the right hand to reinforce the melody with my left hand. And that's how I would think about my role. So that might sound something like this. Something like that. So I could have just left out my left hand entirely, and then I brought it in a little bit to reinforce the top note of the right hand at some points. But you can see that I'm not really thinking about this as a right hand or left hand part. I could also have played that whole thing with my left hand. It's more that I know the piano needs to be playing chord parts in this middle part of the piano where it sits well in the mix with the bass, the drums, and then these guitar parts from the classic recording. All right, let's move on to the second scenario. In this scenario, I'm accompanying a great singer, but I'm the only accompaniment instrument. So it's just a piano arrangement with voice. I don't need to cover the melody, but now I'm filling in for all those other instruments, for guitar, electric bass, drums, and that might mean that I do things a little differently. It also might not actually sound that different. Let's see what I might do. Okay, now there are multiple approaches to how you could accompany a singer in this situation, but that's probably the one I would take. And you can see it wasn't that different from what I did in the full band version. I was still trying to kind of get those characteristic moments in the keys part from the record, that little chromatic thing. And I was adding in some fills, some things that I think are probably based off my memory of what the guitar part does in some moments. The biggest difference is that my left hand now is the bass player. There's no bass player, so I really am digging into octaves in my left hand, and I'm playing things like these walk-ups from one note to the next. And I'm being much less careful about doing things like that that could potentially run into whatever the bass player is doing, because there is no bass player. So when you are the only one accompanying a singer, whether it's your own voice or somebody else's voice, this is kind of the classic approach in pop piano, is that your right hand is taking chord parts, other riffs, important melodies. Your left hand is basically just playing bass. And throughout, I've been using octaves to play bass with my left hand. That means, I'm doubling the G in my thumb and my pinky. If you can't comfortably reach an octave, you can also do this just with single notes. And it's going to have a very, very similar musical effect. Now, if you work on playing a chord accompaniment part like this to a song that you like, in the absence of a singer, don't start to get into the trap of feeling like what you're playing is boring. And that means you're doing something wrong and you need to rearrange the parts. You need to create a new arrangement. That's not what's going on. You're just missing the sound of the melody, right? So if you don't sing yourself, but you want to get better at this kind of solo piano accompaniment style, it's great to play along with recordings. You can even use something like an AI stem splitter to isolate the a cappella vocal and play along with the a cappella vocal from the recording. You can also find a friend who can sing the song with you, and you can practice playing that way. But keep in mind that so far, nowhere in the conversation about what I'm choosing to play with my two hands have I mentioned the idea of something being boring. The problem is never whether it's boring. The problem is whether it's serving the song, right? And if it's a good song, it's not going to be boring. We want to hear the song. And it doesn't matter to the listener whether something's very simple or very complex. What matters is that it's played well and that the song is good. So if you're communicating the important musical elements of the song, even without some of those details I included, like the walk-up, if you can just play these chords in really good time, it's going to be a satisfying cover of the song. You could do something as simple as this. Home in Georgia. And if you're accompanying a singer who delivers the melody well, everybody's going to be happy. You've expressed the song. And by focusing on these more pure musical elements, like do I want to hear bass? Do I want to hear chords? How do I want to accompany the melody that we're hearing wherever that's being played? You can avoid the trap that so many students fall into, where you use whatever theory knowledge you have to try to create some brand new musical element out of thin air that doesn't really have anything to do with the musical intention behind the song. Let's move on to the final scenario. In this scenario, you want to play the song alone at the piano. You don't want to miss the sound of the vocal melody without a singer. So you're trying to communicate every single musical element that the audience is hearing just with what you're doing with your two hands. The first thing to know is this is hard, right? You're trying to do something that's very different than the people were doing on the recording session, or how most professional musicians would likely play the song, to be honest. You've taken away the lyrics, which are a big part of the meaning of the song. So you're trying to reinterpret a vocal melody on piano and create all of the accompaniment that you need on your own. So it's a big challenge. Now, it still might be worth doing. It might be a fun challenge to try. And there's a great tradition of turning pop songs or show tunes into solo piano music. I'm going to give it a shot. You're going to see me doing something where I'll play the melody low on the instrument to start with. I'll repeat that same section, and I'm going to see how my instincts change for how I want to arrange it as I move up the piano. 3, 4. All right, so as before, this is going to be different for every song, right? A lot of the musical elements of what are happening are based on things that are specific to this song. I'm not going off some formula necessarily, but there are some principles I want to point out. First thing is start with the bones. Start with the melody that you want to hear. Figure out how you want to play that on the piano. So you might just play melody by itself. You definitely want to learn it from memory. And then make sure you're really familiar with the basic harmony. So make sure that you can play a bass part of some kind, and you can play the chords here, ideally with good voice leading between inversions, if that makes sense to you. Then, before you make specific decisions about like voice leading or what exact part your two hands are going to play, think big picture. Think about texture. We often talk about texture in a setting where there are multiple instruments. So like in orchestral music, a certain texture might be where a melody is getting doubled by the oboe and the flute, and then there's like an accompaniment part happening in the strings, right? We can also talk about that with solo piano though. So a given texture might be where on the piano is the melody getting played? What sort of like stylistic approach are you taking to the melody? And then what kind of accompaniment part is happening. So that's one texture. And before you even think about those kind of musical nitty-gritty specifics, think about the emotional affect or the kind of energy you want. So the last version of what I just played, I wanted that to be the biggest dynamically. And that informed everything else that I did. It meant that my right hand was high on the piano. I was filling it out with this big chord with an octave frame. And my left hand, which had been a little higher up, went down low on the piano to dig in and play these big meaty octaves. That's kind of like the biggest sound you can get between your two hands on the piano, a big chord like that. So it was a dynamic decision first, and then that informed what I did with my two hands. And that's how I decided what I was going to do with that last version of the arrangement. I'm also making sure that I'm playing the melody well, right? So I'm finding a way to play that melody in octaves and then fill in chord tones between. If anything about that chord part were interfering with the melody, as it often does for students who are first learning to do these kind of arranging things, you want to let go of the chord part because it's not as important as the melody, right? It would be better to hear that than to hear exactly what I just played, but like at a much slower tempo with none of the expression that you want in the melody. And you notice lower down on the piano, I was thinking maybe like a softer dynamic, maybe kind of a darker sound. I often thin things out a little bit when I'm lower down on the instrument because they have a tendency to get muddy. So there, I'm barely playing any chord tones in either of my hands. And I know as a student arranger, there's a lot of difficulty, right, in going from the idea to the actual arrangement and then being able to play it well between your two hands. So it does help a lot to like make a more concrete decision about which hand is going to play the chord part, right? Which hand is playing bass, which hand is playing melody, and how are you going to navigate those things? That's why it makes a lot of sense for students to just put chords in their left hand and melody in their right? It's going to be easier most of the time than trying to play bass in the left hand and somehow cover both melody and chords in your right hand. But no matter what you do, remember that if it's a good song and you're including elements of the song honestly, you're really presenting the melody well. And if you are playing bass, you're playing it in the bass register of the piano. If you're playing chords, you're playing them somewhere where they make sense. If you're including riffs, they're riffs that make sense to the style. If you're doing all those things, your arrangement of the song is not going to be boring. As an audience, it's fun to hear this song just played as a melody. And for sure, if I were playing this song, actually, I had to perform this song as a solo piano cover, there's a pretty good chance that at some point in my arrangement, maybe for some contrast, for like a quieter section, I would play exactly the student arrangement that I played at the beginning of this video. And it's nice to be able to add in these other parts, to add in more rhythm from the bass, maybe add in more chord parts beneath the melody in the right hand, move around to different parts of the piano. But I want you to reframe your thinking from worrying about whether what you're doing sounds like a student version or whether it sounds boring, to instead asking yourself whether your decisions are musically appropriate, whether they make sense for this song and the style you want to play it, and whether they're serving the overall impact of the music. For me as a music student, most of my breakthroughs have happened when I realize the thing I think is the problem is not actually the problem that I'm hearing, right? So it doesn't mean you're wrong if you play your cover version of this song and you say, it sounds like a student version. But it might be that you're trying to solve that by adding complexity to your left hand based on music theory in a way that doesn't have anything to do with the style of the song. So it might be actually that what's missing, what makes it sound like a student interpretation, is not that things are boring. It might be that things just aren't musically appropriate. Maybe you're not performing the song yet in the way that we really want to hear that melody performed. Or you're not adding those little grace notes that make things sound like they belong in this style of soul music. Or maybe you're not playing things in steady rhythm. And it may even be possible that you're overcomplicating things in your arrangement and it's taking away from the song. So I would suggest that you reframe things from worrying about whether your left hand is boring to instead ask whether the decisions you're making as an arranger and performer are musically appropriate and whether they're serving the song. That wraps up our discussion on what the left and right hand might actually do in this style of music in various musical contexts. This comes up with students all the time, so I hope this has been illuminating. You can subscribe to the channel for more free piano education content, and you can also head to pianofluency.com to learn about my membership. My name is Ted with Piano Fluency. Thanks for joining me.